We don't mind having and bearing sanctions banning us from Europe. We are not Europeans. We have not asked for any inch of Europe or any square inch of that territory. So, Blair, keep your England and let me keep my Zimbabwe.
At the heart of Harare, Zimbabwe's capital, a bronze statue of Robert Mugabe cast a long shadow. Once a revered symbol of freedom, it now stands as a reminder of a legacy that promised so much, yet delivered so little. Mugabe, the man who emerged from the shadows of colonialism to lead his country to independence from white minority rule, became a ruler whose country celebrated its independence from the clutches of his greed. This is the story of Robert Mugabe. On Thursday, the 21st day of February 1924, in a mission village in southern Rhodesia, Kutama, the soul destined to occupy a huge chunk of the pages of Zimbabwean history was born to humble parents, a carpenter father and a catechist mother. Both parents had been trained in their professions by Jesuits, the same Catholic order that had organized the mission in their village. The third out of 6 children, he was christened Robert Gabriel Mugabe. Often teased by children his age as a mommy's boy, young Mugabe reflected the virtues of the Jesuits. Usually the model child for self-discipline, Mugabe was secretive, reserved and solitary. He fancied the prospect of withdrawing to himself and reading rather than joining his mates to play. All of the 6 years young Mugabe had spent on earth seemed to be going well, until tragedy struck in a brutal way. Of course, the poverty was there. Mugabe's father had a misunderstanding with one of the Jesuits. Father Jean-Baptiste, the French missionary in charge of the village, expelled the family from the village for this. The children were allowed to remain in the village during school time and then return to their parents during the holidays. In the same period, the family lost Raphael, one of Mugabe's elder brothers. 4 years later, Michael, Mugabe's other elder brother, died after ingesting poisoned maize, reducing their family of 8 to 6, forcing Robert into an uncontested role as the firstborn. To add insult to injury, their father left the family to go search for employment in Bulawayo, only to establish a relationship with another woman, with whom he fathered 3 more children. Mugabe's childhood was over. Shortly after their father left, Father Jean-Baptiste died and was succeeded by Father Jerome O'Hare, who welcomed the return of the Mugabe family to Kutama. After completing 6 years of elementary education in 1941, Mugabe was offered a place on the teacher's training course in Kutama College. His fees were paid in part by his grandfather and Father O'Hare. Mugabe taught in his old school as part of his teaching training. He left Kutama after obtaining his teaching diploma because the situation at home had become grimmer. Just the year before, his father had returned with his 3 children and had died shortly after. Mugabe not only had to fend for his siblings and mother, but now had 3 extra mouths to feed. With his teaching diploma under his belt, Mugabe moved around, teaching at various schools around southern Rhodesia, until life offered him a lifeline in 1949 when he won a scholarship to study at the University of Fort Harare in neighboring South Africa. Mugabe was 25 at this point. At Fort Harare, Mugabe joined the African National Congress Youth League and attended African nationalist meetings, where he was introduced to the ideals of Marxism. Later, he would describe his time at Fort Harare as a turning point of his life. He left the university with a Bachelor's of Arts in History and English Literature in 1952. But it was not just his degree. He left the wave of anger against the colonial system. By the time Robert returned to Rhodesia in 1952, he had become hostile to the colonial system. His university education has taken the scales from his eyes. With this new vision, he could connect the dots, drawing the parallels from the system of administration and resource ownership to the poverty that had been the central theme of his turbulent childhood. Still, the time for active involvement in change has yet to come. For now, Mugabe concerned himself with the most pressing need of the moment: survival. He taught in several schools in both North and Southern Rhodesia. He even obtained 2 bachelor's degrees in education from the University of South Africa and the University of London, both by correspondence. all the while deepening his understanding of the gospel of Karl Marx. At 34, Mugabe left for Ghana. He said, "I went to Ghana as an adventurist. I wanted to see what it could be like in an independent African state." He met Helen Heffron at Achimota College, where he obtained the license that permitted him to teach in Ghana. Attracted by the similarity of her ideas to his, Mugabe started a relationship with her. While Mugabe was teaching abroad, an anti-colonialist movement was established in southern Rhodesia. This movement was led by Joshua Nkomo's Southern Rhodesia's African National Congress, founded in September 1959. The following year, the SRANC was replaced by the more radically oriented National Democratic Party, the NDP. In May of 1960, Mugabe returned to southern Rhodesia, bringing Heffron with him. It was intended to be a short visit. Leopold Takwira, a friend of Mugabe, was particularly fond of and kept urging them to extend their stay. In July 1960, just 2 months after Mugabe's arrival, Takwira was arrested alongside 2 other NDP officials. In protest, Mugabe joined a demonstration of 7,000 people on a march intended to lead right up to the Prime Minister's office in Salisbury. The demonstration was halted by the police outside Studart Hall in Harare Township. By midday the next day, the crowd had grown to 40,000, and a makeshift platform had been erected for the speakers. Mugabe, who had shied away from politics up till this moment, found himself on the list of speakers for that day. Mugabe gave a speech that surprised even himself. His profession accorded him respect from the crowd. His possession of 3 degrees gave him a Zionic ring to his words, and his travels abroad added a layer of authenticity to his claims. After his speech, Mugabe knew that a seed of activism had been planted, and that things will never remain the same again. Mugabe the teacher was buried that day, and in his place, another Mugabe the activist was born. The British government held a Salisbury conference the next year to determine Southern Rhodesia's future. The NDP sent Nkomo as the leader of the delegation. They had hoped to make a case for the British government to support creation of an independent state governed by the black majority, while the representative of the white minority, who then controlled the Southern Rhodesian government, made a case for continued white minority rule. Nkomo agreed to a proposal that allowed black representation through 15 of the 65 seats in the country's parliament. This compromise infuriated Mugabe and others in the NDP, setting the whole nationalist movement in disarray. Mugabe spoke at a number of NDP rallies before the government banned the party in December 1961. Many of its members regrouped as the Zimbabwe's Africa's People Union, ZAPU, days later, which Mugabe appointed its publicity and general secretary. Angered by the increasing hardship and inequality, aggrieved blacks began targeting the white community. To Mugabe, this conflict was necessary to overthrow British colonial dominance and white minority rule. In his words, Europeans must realize that unless the legitimate demands of African nationalism are recognized, then racial conflict is inevitable. Just 9 months after it was founded, ZAPU was banned. Mugabe was soon in trouble alongside Heffron, whom he had married in 1961. He had been charged with making subversive statements during a public speech and awarded bail before his trial. Heffron had been sentenced to 2 years imprisonment for declaring in a speech that the British Queen Elizabeth II can go to hell. She did not face a trial. In August, Heffron gave birth to Mugabe's son, whom they named Namozzanika, a Shona term meaning suffering country. Mugabe insisted that she take their son back to Ghana, but he decided to return to southern Rhodesia. There, African nationalists opposed to Nkomo's leadership had established a new party, the Zimbabwe's African National Union, ZANU, in August. Ndabaningi Sithole became the group's president. Mugabe had been appointed the group's general secretary in absentia. Nkomo responded by forming his own group, the People's Caretaker Council, which was widely called ZAPU after its predecessor. ZAPU and ZANU violently opposed one another, and soon gang warfare broke out between their rival memberships.
I have suffered, I have worked so hard for this country. Before independence, during the war, I worked so hard after independence to make our independence stick. And this man today turns around and he calls me a traitor. Me, a traitor, a man who worked for this country so much. There is no insult to beat this one.
Mugabe was arrested in December 1963. His trial lasted from January to March 1964. during which he refused to retract the subversive statement that he had made publicly. In March 1964, he was sentenced to 21 months imprisonment. Ever the teacher, Mugabe organized study classes for the inmates, teaching them basic literacy, maths, and English. Smuggling messages with the help of sympathetic warders, he and other executives were able to establish a guerrilla workforce in Lusaka. In April 1966, the guerrilla group carried out a failed attempt to destroy power pylons at Sinoa and shortly after attacked a white-owned farm near Hartley, killing its inhabitants. The government responded by returning the members of ZANU executive, including Mugabe, to Salisbury prison in 1966. There, 40 prisoners were divided among the 4 communal cells, with many sleeping on the concrete floor due to overcrowding. Mugabe shared his cell with Stole, Enos Nkala, and Edgar Tekere. He remained there for 8 years, devoting his time to reading and studying. During this period, he gained several further degrees from the University of London, a Master's in Economics, Bachelor of Administration, and 2 law degrees. While Mugabe was in prison, the Rhodesian Front government, now under the leadership of Ian Smith, banned ZANU and ZAPU, and threw all remaining leaders of the country's African nationalist movement in jail. Smith's government declared independence from the United Kingdom in November 1965, renaming Southern Rhodesia as Rhodesia. The UK refused to recognize the legitimacy of this and imposed economic sanctions on the country. In 1972, the African nationalists launched a guerrilla war against Ian Smith's government. Among the revolutionaries, it was known as the Second Chimurenga.
But this is the very center of the area where the battle is being fought. 600 square miles of dense African bush leading down beyond those mountains across the hot Zambezi plain to the border with Mozambique. And out there somewhere are the guerrillas.
Paramilitary groups based themselves in neighboring Tanzania and Zambia. ZANU's military wing, the Zimbabwe African Nationalist Liberation Army, received its funding from China, while the military wing of ZAPU, the Zimbabwean People's Revolutionary Army, received its funding from the Soviet Union. Sithole, the leader of ZANU, was suspended from the organization after a message he had sent out from prison instructing ZANU activists to assassinate Smith fell into the wrong hands. He had been put on trial and, desperate to avoid a death sentence, had denounced the party. In his place, Mugabe was selected to be his successor. Upon his release from prison, Mugabe, who had always been vocal about the place of violence in the struggle to end white minority rule, left for Mozambique to lead ZANLA in its guerrilla war. Things took a turn when, in a Commonwealth meeting held in 1979, Margaret Thatcher, the then British Prime Minister, announced that it would recognize and legitimize Zimbabwe if it transitioned into democratic rule. This revelation not only brought an end to Smith's government, but it also altered the political fortunes of the African nationalists. It also evoked a new dimension in the rivalry between Mugabe and Nkomo. In the run-up to the elections of 1980, Mugabe survived 2 assassination attempts. The campaign was marred by voter intimidations and violence perpetuated by both Mugabe and Nkomo. ZANU-PF, rebranded to become a political party, secured 63% of the national vote, gaining 57 of the 80 parliamentary seats allocated for black parties and providing them with an absolute majority. ZAPU gained 20 seats, and UANC had 3. Mugabe was elected MP for Salisbury constituency of Highfield. Southern Rhodesia gained independence on the 18th of April 1980. Mugabe took the oath of office as the country's first prime minister shortly after midnight. He renamed the country Zimbabwe, removed status of Cecil Rhodes, and renamed the country's seat after black nationalists. While Mugabe preached socialism, his government budgetary policies were conservative, operating within a capitalist framework and emphasizing the need for foreign investment. In office, Mugabe sought a gradual transformation away from capitalism and tried to build upon existing state institutions. From 1980 to 1990, the country's economy grew by an average 2.7% a year. But this was outstripped by population growth. The unemployment rate rose, reaching 26% in 1990. The government ran a budget deficit year on year that averaged 10% of the country's gross domestic product. Under Mugabe's leadership, there was massive expansion in education and health spending. In 1980, Zimbabwe had just 177 secondary schools. By 2000, this number had risen to 1,548. During this period, the adult literacy rate rose from 62% to 82%, one of the highest levels in Africa. Mugabe had previously offered the ceremonial position of Zimbabwe's presidency to Nkomo, who had turned him down in favor of becoming Minister of Home Affairs. As stated earlier, both men were not particularly fond of each other. In January 1981, Mugabe demoted Nkomo in a cabinet reshuffle. In February, violence between ZAPU and ZANU-PF supporters broke out among the battalions stationed at Ntabazinduna, soon spreading to other army bases, resulting in 300 deaths. An arms cart featuring landmines and an anti-aircraft missile was then discovered at Ascot Farm, which was partly owned by Nkomo. Mugabe cited this as an evidence that ZAPU was plotting a coup. Likening Nkomo to a cobra in the house, Mugabe sacked him from government, and ZAPU-owned businesses, farms, properties were seized. It will be the beginning of his handling opposition high-handedly. In December 1987, Zimbabwe's parliament amended the constitution and declared Mugabe executive president. This new position combined the roles of the head of state, the head of government, and commander-in-chief of the armed forces, giving him absolute power over the young country. According to Martin Meredith, his biographer, Mugabe now had a virtual stranglehold on government machinery and unlimited opportunities to exercise patronage. This constitutional amendment also abolished the 20 parliamentary seats reserved for white representatives and left parliament less relevant and independent. In the build-up to the 1990 election, the main opposition party in that election was the Zimbabwe Unity Movement, launched in April 1989 by Tekere, one of the men Mugabe had shared a cell at Salisbury prison. Tekere accused him of betraying the revolution and establishing a dictatorship. ZANU-PF employed the same tactic that had brought them to power 10 years ago: voter intimidation. One television advert featured images of a car crash with the statement,
"This is one way to die. Another is to vote Zoom. Don't commit suicide. Don't be foolish. Vote ZANU-PF and leave."
In the election, Mugabe was re-elected president with nearly 80% of the vote, while ZANU-PF secured 116 of the 119 seats available.
Do you accept responsibility yourself? Does your party accept responsibility for any incident involving intimidation, any incident involving fear among the population?
We have not had any incident whatsoever reported to us concerning intimidation. There may be one or two incidents relating to contact with the security forces, but in those circumstances, the security forces should not have been deployed at all. It's contrary to the agreement that they are just now on deployment. And our people naturally get worried that they are being encircled by the forces, and they have a right to defend themselves and the right to defend the masses too in those circumstances.
Over the course of the 1990s, Zimbabwe's economy faced a steady decline. Mugabe blamed the country's economic problems on Western nations and white Zimbabwean minority who still control most of the commercial agriculture, mine and manufacturing industry. He called on supporters to strike fear in the hearts of the white man, our real enemy. By the mid-1990s, Mugabe had become a full-blown dictator, broking no opposition, contemptuous of the rule of law and human rights. The parliamentary elections held in 2000 saw the movement for democratic change clinch 57 seats, with ZANU-PF retaining just 62 seats, putting an end to the two-thirds majority they had relied on to make constitutional change. It would be the beginning of the end for Robert Mugabe, who at this point was making enemies faster than he was making friends. Mugabe claimed that the build-up to the 2002 presidential election represented the third Chimurenga, and that it would set Zimbabwe free from colonial heritage. In the build-up to the election, the government changed the electoral rules and regulations to improve Mugabe's chances of winning. New security legislation were introduced, making it illegal to criticize the president. The Defense Force commander, General Vitalis, stated that the military will not recognize any election other than the Mugabe victory. In spite of this, it was a keenly contested affair between him and MDC's Morgan Tsvangirai. Mugabe won the election, scoring 54% to Morgan's 42%. Mugabe extended his hold over Zimbabwe, winning 2 more elections in 2008 and 2015. At 93, Mugabe divulged his intention to remain in power until God says come.
Zimbabwe's President Robert Mugabe is under house arrest as the country's military seized power on Wednesday. But it claims the move is not a military coup, despite the heavy presence of army vehicles blocking public institutions.
On the 15th of November 2017, 1 week after he fired his vice president, the Zimbabwe National Army placed Mugabe under house arrest at his Blue Roof mansion as part of what it described as an action against criminals. 4 days later, he was sacked as the leader of ZANU-PF, with the party offering him an ultimatum to resign as president by noon the next day or face impeachment. Mugabe dared his party to do their worst. At the joint Senate session where he was to be impeached, Mugabe sent in a letter saying that he had resigned, effective immediately.
I, Robert Mugabe, in terms of Section 96, subsection 1 of the Constitution of Zimbabwe, hereby formally tender my resignation as the President of the Republic of Zimbabwe with immediate effect.
Mugabe was given full diplomatic status and out of the public funds, a 5-bedroom house, up to 23 staff members and personal vehicles. He was further permitted to keep the business interests and other wealth that he had amassed while in power, and he received an additional payment of about $10 million. Thus, the reign of Mugabe as president came to an end. Mugabe was hospitalized in Singapore in 2019. Though his family kept it a secret, he was believed to be suffering from later stages of cancer and had become unresponsive to treatment. He died on 6 September, aged 95. His body was flown back home and he was given a state funeral. He was buried on 26th of September in his hometown of Kutama. For 37 years, Mugabe was the president of Zimbabwe. No Zimbabwean did more to fight for Zimbabwe's independence. But having won independence, Mugabe did not turn Zimbabwe into the developed country that most people expected. He was one of the most educated leaders in the whole world. Yet this did not show in his leadership, except in his ability to extend his rule year after year. Mugabe divides opinions strongly between those who see him as a Pan-African leader and those who accuse him of being a dictator. Wherever you stand in this, Mugabe came and stayed too long. He could have copied his compatriot from South Africa, Nelson Mandela, who served for a single term and passed on the baton to the next generation. Leadership is a responsibility given by the people. When the people say they no longer need you, it's time to go. As for Zimbabwe, it still struggles with the legacy of Mugabe, for the system he has established has been continued by the man who succeeded him. Thank you for watching this episode. Kindly share this, subscribe, and send to your friends. Till I see you again, bye bye.